Welcome to this presentation all about structuring our writing. I'm Justin Rempel. In this talk, we're going to be discussing what structure means, what it looks like in fiction and in nonfiction forms. So to start, we have to do definitions. What is structure? What do I mean when I say structure? When we're talking about structure in our writing, we mean organization, we mean order. To structure your writing means to organize your ideas in an order that makes sense. The first things come first, the second things come second, the third things come third, and so on. Structure is a really critical component of clear communication. With bad structure or with no structure, our communication will inevitably be difficult to understand. So why do we need to structure our writing? It's really important, not just for the reader, but also for the writer. Why is it important for the writer? Structure helps the writer during the entire writing process. It helps the writer to stay organized, to organize their thinking, to organize their research. It really helps the writer to stay focused and on task, to remember what they're talking about. And it also helps with thoroughness. It makes sure that the writer covers all of the important points and covers those points in an order that makes sense to the writer. It's got to make sense to the writer to make sense to the reader. Why is structure important for the reader? Well, during the reading process, structure is critical to help with reader comprehension. If there's good structure in place, it will maximize the reader's ability to understand the material and to understand it well. It also helps the reader to focus on the writing, to focus on the topic, and to follow the writer's train of thought. It also helps to maintain interest. Structured writing is good writing, and because it makes sense and is easy to follow, it is more interesting to the reader. So we're going to start by talking about structure in fiction or made-up storytelling. In fiction, we often talk about structure as plot. This word plot refers to the storyline, the series of events that make up the story. And when we think about the order that the series of events needs to follow, we are thinking about how to structure our story. Plot points are significant events that happen throughout the story. So we need to think about a good order for those plot points to happen in. Typically, plot is made up of 5 parts, and you can see the diagram on the screen. This arc, or this little hill, sort of models the typical structure of a story. It doesn't have to, but especially if you're a beginning writer, this is a good place to start because most stories follow this to some degree. The first thing that happens, the very first part of the story's structure, is the introduction. This is when all of the important information that the reader needs to know up front is introduced. That means the setting is introduced, the time and the place when the story is happening, and the key characters are established. Everything that the reader is going to need to know moving forward. The second thing that happens is rising action, which means that the conflict increases in intensity. So we come across some kind of problem or conflict and it escalates. It grows more and more intense and more problematic until we reach the third point, which is the climax. This is when the conflict is at its most intense point. The problem is the most difficult and seemingly insurmountable that it's ever been. Once we reach the climax, we have to start thinking about how to wrap up the story. After the conflict reaches its most intense point, we reach point 4, which is the falling action, sometimes called the denouement. The conflict passes and the story begins to deal with the fallout or the consequences of that conflict and of that climax. Point 5 is the resolution or the conclusion, when everything wraps up. That means all of our storylines, our plots, and our subplots that we've been working on need to get tied up nice and neatly. All the loose ends are taken care of, unless, of course, you do a cliffhanger ending in which some questions remain unanswered. So in practice, what does it look like to put a story in order? Again, if you are a novice writer, I would highly recommend following the standard plot structure. It's good practice, and not only that, but also look for it in the stories that you encounter, the books that you read, the movies that you watch, the TV shows, the books or podcasts that you listen to. Most stories follow this kind of structure. Begin by establishing your setting and key characters. The first things come first. The most important information that the reader needs to know is introduced early. Then introduce some kind of conflict, some kind of problem, some kind of obstacle. Then include plot twists, which are unexpected plot points. This could be failed attempts at overcoming the conflict or the problem. This could be complications, extra wrinkles that we didn't know about beforehand. You don't want to make your problem too easy to solve. There should be challenges or hurdles along the way that make things increasingly difficult. You need to build intensity and complexity throughout the story all the way up to the climax, that most intense point of conflict. After the climax, it's really important that you cover all your bases in the resolution. That means you tie up all loose ends. All problems that you introduced should be solved. All characters should have some kind of ending to their character arc. You need to make sure that the reader leaves feeling satisfied. For beginning writers, follow this plot structure, write in chronological order. Chronological means time order, the order that things happen in time. First things first, second things second, third things third. If you're a more experienced writer, you might want to begin experimenting with changing the plot structure. So for example, you might want to have a cliffhanger ending where there isn't complete resolution, where the reader is left guessing. There are some unanswered questions. You might also want to experiment with non-linear storytelling, which is where you tell the ending first, or you tell the middle first, and the first part in the middle, and you rearrange this story structure. That is something that you should only do if you're a confident and experienced writer, you're very familiar with the classic story structure, and you're ready to start playing around with it a little bit. What does structure look like in nonfiction writing? In nonfiction writing, we typically move from simple information to complex, introductory to advanced, beginner to expert. So we start with simplistic concepts and definitions, and we build on top of those, adding more and more complexity throughout. Unless you specifically know otherwise, assume that your readers know nothing about your topic. Assume that they need to be told everything, all the key definitions and concepts at the start, before you move on to discussing other things. Of course, if you know that you're going to be writing for a group of experts, you can start at a little bit more of an advanced level. When you're writing nonfiction, begin by introducing your topic. This is the subject that you're writing about. Then introduce your thesis, which is the main message about your topic. So for example, you might be writing about the octopus. That is an animal, and it could be a subject for a science paper. Your thesis might be that the octopus plays a really important role in its ecosystem. It's an important part of the nature community around it. That's a message about your topic that you're going to have to prove with some supporting points. Once you've introduced your topic and your thesis, you need to establish all important concepts and definitions early. Again, assume that your readers know nothing, that this is all brand new information to them. Have at least 3 supporting points for your thesis. So if you're going to argue that the octopus is critical in its ecosystem, in its nature community, you need 3 good reasons why. Outline your supporting points in order in the introduction. It's a good idea to indicate early on, here are my reasons for saying what I'm saying. And then when you actually write about the supporting points, you're going to expand on them using research, using concrete examples. The order should make sense to you as a writer. If it doesn't make sense to you as a writer, it's not going to make sense to the reader. Sometimes there isn't really a logical order, especially for those supporting points, and you just need to pick something. Here again, it helps if you've introduced the supporting points early on in your introduction, and you can follow the outline that you've introduced early on in your writing. So let's take a look at some examples of ways to structure nonfiction writing. It really depends on your subject matter, how you're going to think about this and approach this. For example, if you're writing an instructional text, a series of instructions, say a recipe, well, you're going to follow a sequential order. What is the first thing you need to do? What is the second thing you need to do? What is the third thing you need to do? This is going to be a sequential series of events. So the order is very prescribed for you. Make sure that you put each step in your set of instructions in the proper order. If you're writing in the field of history, maybe you're writing a biography, you're going to want to follow chronological order, which is the time sequence. What happened earliest, what happened next, what happened next, what happened next, following the order of events as they happened in time. If you're writing about an issue or a problem, it might be a social issue, it might be a medical issue, it might be in some other field. A lot of nonfiction writing is about issues or problems. You're going to follow a structure called problem to solution, and it looks generally like this. The first thing you discuss is what is the problem. This is your introduction and your key definitions. The next thing you discuss is where does it come from? This is when you talk about the origins of the problem or root causes. The next thing you're going to want to talk about is what difference does this problem make? What actual impact or effects does it have on the world around it? What are the symptoms or traits of this problem? The last thing you're going to write about is what can we do about it? And that's when you discuss solutions, strategies, and supports to address the problem. So you're moving from problem to solution, a very standard structure. The last structure I want to talk about is common when you're dealing with studies or research or testing of any sort. And this structure is called methods to results. It's kind of similar to problem to solution. In methods to results, you introduce your topic and your hypothesis. Now, when you're doing research or testing, you have some kind of hypothesis, which is an idea that you want to prove. You next need to describe your methods that you're using. How are you researching? How are you testing? Then you want to outline the key results from your research. Here's our hypothesis. Here's how we tested our idea, and here's what the results showed us. The last thing you need to do is talk about the implications of your results. What do your results mean? Interpret them for the reader, and explain whether your hypothesis was confirmed or not. So these are some examples of very common structures for nonfiction writing. Again, sometimes it really doesn't matter and you just need to pick an order, but generally you start with the basics first, your key concepts and definitions, and you build on that in terms of complexity. Generally, you introduce a thesis early on, which is your main message or idea, and then you have supporting points to prove it.